Okay, let me share the slides. Can you see that? Okay.
Yep.
And CTL is a tech transfer office of Cornell, and we manage intellectual property and other technologies at Cornell. And our mission here is to catalyze the commercialization of Cornell technologies to reach societal impact, and also to foster the creation and growth of startup companies based on our technologies. And here I highlighted some of the products and startups from Cornell, and some of you may recognize that. And from drugs to chips to agriculture products and animal health. And then many of that are used in the market and generate a lot of societal impact that influence people's life and regional economy. And particularly for startup in recent years, that's increasingly our path of our technology to reach society and also generate regional economic development, supporting startup companies and economies. And here is a graphic. In the graphics, that people see the impact more visually. And this in the early years, 1980, when the BIDO Act started to currently, the startup companies and based on Cornell technology has seen exponential growth, as you can see that. And also not only these startup, but they're not like zombies walking around without activities, right? So our startup are growingly much more active and in recent years. And here the data were collected, and from these startups, last year, the funding for our startup passed $500 million last year alone. And accumulatively, there's more than $3 billion in funding for the startup. So they're really actively generating new products and services, generating jobs, and developing for the region. So these are certainly something we want to continue to promote and grow, and which is also related to today's subject, of course, how to grow these startups. Right? Growing startups also always start from some idea. There may be some technology, how to raise money, how to pitch the idea, how to grow the companies, and is tremendously important to lead to future success, right? It's just one more side thing too, and university technology is a very early stage, right? From the lab to the market is a long way, and you all heard about this Death Valley. And so from university side, I just want to highlight the recent program that to help the lab, to help the people like postdocs and students, and to go through that to the successful startups, and to help the initial just funded startup to reach there. We have this Ignite funding. So I encourage people to visit our website to utilize and leverage these opportunities for the future. And now, without further ado, I'm going to introduce today's speakers. And they're from Osage University Partners, and one of the VC firms. Work very closely with many universities. Certainly here at Cornell, we have long-term partnership with Osage Partners. And today's two speakers, Kirsten Leute, and who has been with the firm for many years for university relations. And prior to that, she worked at Stanford Tech Transfer Office for many years, and long-term colleague and friend, and really knows a lot about university startup and early stage growth. And another speaker, Ajay, Rayasam, and he has been with the investment team of Osage for a few years, and has engaged with many university researchers, entrepreneurs in this very early stage of development. So they have helped many university startup in that direction, and heard many pitches. So they have a lot to say, and how you should get prepared in that direction. So I will let you two take this over and talk with our audience. All right.
Great. Thank you so much, Alice. Ajay is going to share the presentation in just a second here, but I will start off just saying a little bit more. Osage University Partners, we're a venture capital firm that invests in startups out of academic institutions, as our name implies. We've been around for over a dozen years at this point, but as mentioned, Ajay and I haven't been around for all of those years. We're currently investing out of a third fund, about to start investing out, actually just started to investing out of a fourth fund. But please do follow up with us if you do have questions. If you have a startup company or are interested in speaking with us about what it is that your startup that's coming out of the university is doing, we can talk more about that another time, because I know that we only have a short time with you today to talk about pitching, a very important subject of how you are going to do that to investors when you get to that point. So I'm going to give some intro slides into this. If we go to the next slide, about how you should approach your investors. And then Ajay is actually going to go into depth on the slides themselves, what we like to see in the decks that are pitched to us, and the information that we like to hear about that. So we can go to the next slide. So obviously, there are many sources of funding for startups. And as we're going to talk a little bit about on the next slide, but we're going to stay on the slide right now, is that, there are only certain types of funding that are appropriate for startups, depending on what it is that their activities or expected activities are in the next months to years. And funding happens based on what it is those activities are. So obviously, most of you are incredibly familiar with grants that come from federal organizations, other organizations as well. Some of those grants are for basic research. Some of those grants can be for your startup opportunities. Obviously, the SBIR and STTR programs are well known, but there's more and more focus that is happening on getting ideas to the next stage, or getting technologies to the next stages, to de-risk them to the point that other sources of funding would be available to them, or to honestly to kill the idea. There are a lot of terrific ideas out there, but not all of them actually are going to end up either having a market, or they're not going to work. The number one reason actually that life science companies fail is because they end up not working in practice. It's a really, perhaps the initial science looks terrific, but when you try to actually get it to work in a product, the science doesn't actually follow into a product. So we talked about grants. Often the next source of funding, when you're actually taking a technology out of the university, can be friends and family. So this is going to be some basic, the reason that you're getting this friends and family funding, which is going to be, in these low dollar amounts still at this point, tens of thousands to maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars, is you're doing some critical initial experiments that are helping you take this from that initial academic bench research to those next steps. And the hope, of course, is that that's going to provide some further data that will make proof of concept funding available. Some of that proof of concept funding can occur at your academic institutions. A lot of institutions these days have proof of concept funds, but there are also proof of concept funding that you can get from angels and from accelerators, from venture philanthropy groups. And this funding is typically going to be more in the hundreds of thousands of dollars level to maybe to the low millions of dollars. It may not all come from one source. It may come from a group that comes together around what it is that you're trying to accomplish next. And you're going to, especially at this point, but maybe even at the earlier points, you're going to want some kind of outside mentors helping you decide what are these critical proof of concept experiments that we're going to do that'll actually help us get to the next steps of funding, as well as what will make industry interested in what is that we're doing for the technology. And that proof of concept funding hopefully gets you to the point that, yes, this is something that we should either go forward with venture capital with, or we should pursue other areas of funding. Venture capital is not for everyone. Venture capital is usually when a company is going to need millions of dollars at that point. It can be the low millions, it can be a lot more that as well. But it is that you're trying to rapidly scale the growth of the company based on the technology area that you're in. There's obviously a lot of different areas that we cover in deep science out of universities, but you're getting venture capital in at that point because you need a lot of money to get to the next steps as far as the research and development towards your product. And then the last kind of, and actually sometimes these can be intertwined, step on this is the growth, where you're having strategic corporate money also come in saying, yes, potentially we would like to partner with you. We'd like to invest in this and potentially see this technology taken even further. So we have some examples of those types of companies. We mainly actually, unfortunately, have tech companies noted here, Google, Cisco, et cetera. But there are other, the life sciences side there, we have Pfizer noted, GSK, but J&J, AstraZeneca, et cetera, often can be strategic partners with your company somewhere at this point as well. There's a lot more that we could go into on this, but we want to get more to the next parts of this presentation. But I already said a bunch of this, but the majority of academic startups are not necessarily going to need venture capital. Venture capital is a very expensive form of capital because it basically, when you receive venture capital, you're giving up a portion of your company to the venture capitalists for that buy-in in your company. And then there are only so many venture capital groups around. So VCs end up looking at hundreds of businesses in order to make even one investment. For example, our fund is currently this number is actually a little bit old. We're currently tracking about 9,000 opportunities out of academic institutions, but we usually make 10 to 12 new investments per year. So it's a very small number of those that we actually make in investments per year. And that's very typical for most venture capital funds. They learn about a lot of deals, but then they're really winnowing down what it is they invest in. So that's why your pitching is so important and you're developing your pitch deck. So just initial interaction with regards to your pitch deck, you only get one chance to make that at first impression, so make it a good one. It may be your initial interaction is a short one with the VC firm. You need to know what that short pitch is that you're going to make and what's going to make them come back and say, hey, we would like to have more information on your particular opportunity. You can't approach VCs in any way possible. VCs do read their emails, do look at things, but having a warm introduction is absolutely helpful. The other things that you can do to help yourself get noticed is really be on point with what it is that that investor invests in. For example, Ajay and I get emails all the time from companies, and often, if there is nothing in the email that says why this is a university or academic associate or research institution associated deal, it makes me gonna wonder, like, did they do their homework? Did they actually understand what it is that we do as investors? And then, we want to have, basic information about the company and why it is that we should be interested. So we want to know who you are, what we're often investing in the team that's associated with this. We actually are always investing in that team. Who are you and why would we be interested in investing in you? We want to know about the data. As you'll hear from, I think from Ajay a little bit more, we're very focused on the science behind what we're investing in and understanding like why this actually potentially is going to work down the road, both as the market opportunity, but also the science is going to work to make that actual product. What is the market for that opportunity, what you've already done with funding, what you've accomplished to date, how you've hit your timelines, and what it is that you're planning on doing with that. So getting a very concise story on that and being able to pitch it is going to make a VC more interested. And I'm sure you've heard a lot of this before, but we're going to keep pounding it in because it's very important.
We also have a blog post that outlines, how to approach a VC for the initial interaction, and we can link it towards the end of the webinar.
Yeah, I'll put that in a little bit when you're talking, Ajay. Okay,
Perfect.
That's a great idea. All right, next up, who's going to pitch? Let's talk about that. So we like to see a team come together, maybe in pitch. But sometimes that team isn't available yet. There may be things that may be happening. There may not be a lot of people associated with this. But when you are pitching, you need to think about who you are and what your strengths are that you're bringing to that startup opportunity. So we like to see, obviously, if you're the main lead entrepreneur associated with that, you're the leader of your organization. And so we want to see that you're going to be able to lead the team and why that team is going to follow you, that you have an understanding of actual how the product needs to be developed and whether the steps associated with it. So you have this domain expertise and understand how to get a product to market, and that you are enthusiastic and have conviction behind what the opportunity is that is being followed and why this is such a unique and compelling opportunity that we're going to want to invest in it. And then you are as the entrepreneur, typically you are the lead fundraiser. And you need to be a good fundraiser, but also show those people you're raising money from, how you're going to create value from them down the road. Because most venture capital groups you speak with, they are doing this because they have told their investors that they can earn money based off of their thesis that they have for investing in companies. Now, that's not always the case. That there are social impact investors, there are other types of investors. But when you're talking with venture capitalists, by and large, they are investing because they are looking for returns that their investors have been told that they potentially could gain. Now, on the scientist side, if you're a scientist who's pitching, obviously you're going to focus on that science and the conviction you have on that science and the data you have that you think shows why someone should be interested in that. And then you're going to want to show how that science is actually going to translate to product opportunities. Now, you may be starting out with one certain product opportunity, but you're also going to show hopefully a pipeline that may actually go down the way that actually will extend the opportunity for this technology. And you're going to then know what your next steps are as far as that product development, that timeline and the milestones associated with it. Anything else you wanted to add, Ajay?
No, that's great so far.
Next slide then. Okay, so this next slide is actually taken from, and sorry, we don't have the reference on it. We really should have the reference on it. But this is actually taken from a blog post that someone else wrote, but there's so many truisms in here with regards to raising capital that we really think it's important to run through, and most investors know this, but you really have to be careful about who you actually approach as far as potential investors. Like, you don't want to, like I said before, you don't want to just blanket the market. You don't want to just go out and contact everyone. You really want to target the investors who you think are the prime ones who could be interested in what they're doing, understand what stages they invest in. Therefore, they invest in your area. They know your market. They invest in the stage of company that you're at, and that they actually have funds available to invest. That's a whole nother talk about how venture capital works and the stage of their funds and where they're at. But you need to understand that they actually still have capital available to invest, perhaps as a first time in a company, and will also then have hopefully capital for your follow-on rounds after that. Be very realistic. Fundraising is incredibly challenging, and you're going to get a lot of no's, and you're going to have to, it's not kissing a lot of frogs, but you're going to have to make a lot of pitches in order to hopefully get to those yeses. And you're going to get better and better at pitching as you go along. And one of the things that you can always do is ask for feedback with regards to your pitch. What else would you have liked to have heard? Was there anything that you went along and I didn't express, or something like that? That's also why mentors, if this is the first time you're doing it, mentors are so helpful to you, is to actually get that pitching down with them first, and they will anticipate some of the questions that you're going to be asked as you do fundraising as well. When you do actually get a VC interested, you're going to have multiple meetings with them. It's not just like, oh, we're really interested in this. Yes, here's a term sheet. We're going to go forward. It's going to usually start out with an associate on the team. They'll become interested. They'll, maybe put it to a broader audience within their group, and then perhaps another, until it gets to the point of kind of a full investment committee review at the fund. But it is going to involve multiple meetings before you get an investment. And then I'm just going to really briefly talk about private placement agents. So there are agents who say they will, basically will go out there and try to find capital for you. I would say in general, in university startups, this is incredibly rare. Like, it's not something I would say that we see very often out of university startups, but most of the time you want to make these approaches yourself and show that you've done your homework, that you are finding the right investors for your startup company. Next slide. So I think it's the next two slides are just actually showing examples of different types of investors. And I think these are maybe a little bit out of date, but this is where you can go and find out where different investors actually invest. And so this is, you go onto their websites, there's other places you can look, but you need to understand what stages they're investing in and what they're investing in. So this just runs through an example of the different investors, and typically, at least in the past, at the stages that they invested in and in the industry areas that they invested in. So this is particularly for life sciences. When we first created this slide, for example, on the very last line, there were a lot of crossover investors who used to only kind of invest late stage into companies, maybe because sometimes even when companies are already gone public, they do later rounds. But a lot of those investors have moved back now on the timeline and actually invest a lot earlier in those companies as well. So
yeah, I would also add on the life science side, there's been a proliferation of, let's say, Y Combinator, like accelerator programs like
IndieBio,
Nucleate is a good example.
Yeah.
And those are great training programs to get to a certain point that give you exposure to early stage investors. And I'll also add that there's a new movement of tech bio, meaning that tech oriented funds are starting to invest in early stage biotech companies. So the landscape has shifted a little bit, and it remains to be seen if it's going to stay that way. But that's sort of the newer options that are coming out nowadays.
Yeah. So we'll move on to the next slide. And actually, before I just review this slide quickly, I did want to mention, like, we are open to questions. We would suggest that you put questions in the chat. I'll start reviewing them and I'll ask them to Ajay as we go along. So please do put questions in the chat, and I'll ask them to him as we go along here. So this last slide, actually, I'm sorry, Ajay, you're supposed to, this is your slide.
I'm happy to take over. So
all right, yeah.
Just a continuation from what you were saying on the tech and physical sciences side, where is my primary focus, is that the landscape is pretty similar, but the number of VCs that have come out since the last few years have been incredible. And so similarly to Nucleate, there's Activate for climate tech fellows. There's a lot more programs to support early stage entrepreneurs. And so the basic crux of this slide is just to, do your research as much as you can. Try to understand who invests in, let's say, deep tech or tough tech. There are organizations like us, The Engine, others that, have a sector focus. And so just match what you're trying to accomplish with what the investors are, and it'll just make for a better conversation and potentially a match. But also, as Kirsten mentioned, the probability of receiving an investment is quite low. And so it's a very subjective business, and we'll walk through kind of like how we think about that, how we think about pitch decks. But ultimately, you're more likely to hear no. And I would just suggest using it as data to improve your pitch over time.
The one other thing I'd say, and I know we're moving on to the actual close to the decks now, is it's not just doing homework on the firm, it's doing homework on the investors themselves, and therefore figuring out maybe the right investors at that firm to you and those people to contact. So
yeah, exactly. So, and to build on that, it's like some particular investors in let's say a generalist fund, they may have a sector of focus. One may be focused on climate tech, semiconductors, or software. And whatever you're trying to build should align with whoever has invested previously in that space. One, it'll just be super helpful to get feedback. And two, they'll probably have a playbook for what success looks like. And that'll just make for a more fruitful conversation. So moving on, the first, I think the high level reason for sharing this is that one thing I've noticed among researchers and early stage entrepreneurs from the university ecosystem is that it's very difficult to translate your work from an academic perspective to industry or explain to an investor what you're doing. And so the basic takeaway message is, as much as you can, try to keep it simple. I'm looking at 1,000 pitches. I'm not an expert in your particular area. Maybe some investors with a similar background will be able to get up to speed faster, but the name of the game is actually being able to explain what you're trying to accomplish in as little words as possible, and ideally as simple as possible. And so if you've been on Reddit, it's like, explain it to me like I'm 5. And then that's actually a very effective way of getting your pitch across, because ultimately you're trying to tell a story and you're trying to sell a story to an investor of why whatever you're building is going to be a large business. And so some questions I like to think about when you are going through a pitch, it's like, what are you trying to accomplish? What are you building? How is it done? What is new in your approach? Why is it so novel? Who else has tried this approach? What is the competition? How will you spend the money? How much do you need? How long will it take to your best estimates? Things always change, but it's more about building a relationship between the investor and gaining trust with the entrepreneur over time. And the more you've thought about those questions and are able to answer in as little words as possible, really, it'll just make for a more effective conversation. And so other general pitching guidelines, honestly, at the end of the day, you have to be yourself. Everyone has a different style. But high level, you can only get better through practice. Try to address any questions. I think that's a form of self-awareness. So if you're missing a tech lead or if you're missing a business development person, I would think about answers to those type of questions, like the obvious missing pieces or things you want to address. I would try to address them as much as possible. Number 2 is sort of a personal preference. Some investors want the pitch decks in advance, some don't. I prefer it so I can have a more fruitful conversation, but I can understand why an entrepreneur would be reluctant to do so. Slides, ideally more visually appealing, so we can understand as quickly as possible what you're trying to accomplish. And I kind of mentioned it previously. It's like being clear, concise, keeping it brief. And ideally, you want to engage the investor. So it's more of a conversation as opposed to a pitch. I think it's always better to have a two-way conversation. It also demonstrates interest across both sides. And it also leads to building that trust between an investor and entrepreneur, because that's what it's ultimately about.
We have a couple of questions actually, Jay, that I'm just going to ask quickly because I think they're relevant to what we already talked about. So the first one is this person's wondering about the background of the VCs we interact with during fundraising. Is it more scientific? Is it more business? And then how should a funding seeker adapt to different types of VCs?
Yeah, it depends on the firm. So is there any more information on the person?
They're in biochemistry.
Okay. So in biochemistry, you're more likely to speak with associates, at least initial calls, who more or less have a background in whatever your
the science.
Whatever your science is, exactly. Yeah. So typically life science VCs recruit for PhDs or MD PhDs on occasion. So I think what I've noticed within that archetype is that they really like to get the science to understand what you're building. And so I think you should expect it to be a detailed conversation on, selecting ideal targets, or how does the initial what is the initial novel idea behind the science. And in some ways you want that because they've seen and recognized a lot of patterns that have worked in the industry, and so there's a lot to learn from there. That's the answer to the first question. What was the second part of the question?
So the second question actually is different. What are the key considerations when engaging corporate venture capital firms versus typical VCs?
Good question. I from the context I have for corporate ventures is that they have an element of trying to align whatever investment opportunity to some initiative internally in the corporation. And so I think the more you can conduct that research on your end, maybe there's, for example, let's say Xerox Ventures has an initiative on 3D printing. They want to increase their manufacturing. If you could find ways to align to them and position yourself as part of their, high level goals, you'll probably make more headway. And most of those high level goals are probably publicly announced. And so that's the fundamental difference between a corporate investor and let's say, a traditional VC, is that there's some kind of alignment that's required with the greater organization. And the other elements I've noticed is that they may take a little bit longer in terms of diligence. So they're going to ask more questions. They have to get more internal people involved. 3, they don't always lead an investment round. So they may wait for appropriate lead. It's not always the case. Some corporate ventures tend to lead, like Hitachi Ventures. But those are the fundamental differences that I noticed. Like, other than that, I think most of them will ask similar questions. But from what I understand, they're always trying to rationalize how does this fit within the greater corporate mission.
Great. Thank you so much. We'll move on to the next part of the talk.
Great. So elements of the deck itself. I think this is mostly self-explanatory. I like to look at the Sequoia business plan, which sort of outlines the same thing, but high level, it's about telling a story, trying to grab as much attention as little time as possible. So from the introduction, simply state what you're trying to accomplish, highlight the team, which depending on the stage, I think it's pretty universal regardless of stage, but especially early on, the investors are betting on you. And they're trusting your instincts and your ability to execute over time to prove out your thesis on this particular startup. So I would say that the most important element, regardless of all these slides, are really the team itself, about your backgrounds, about who you've recruited along the way. And so that's an area of interest for all investors. The second area of focus, and we'll go into each section individually, is the market opportunity. Ultimately, for most venture capitalists, we have 10 years to return liquidity to our limited partners. And so we have a short time scale. And so we have to also return, in some cases, many hundreds of millions of dollars back to our investors. And typically, the way returns are distributed over time, it's power law distributed, meaning that a few investments carry the return for the entire fund. And so therefore, the assumption for most venture capitalists is that you have to invest in a large market opportunity, which is why we, talk about that so much. So when we talk about a large TAM, we're talking about, $1 billion or more ideally. And so that's an area where I think is a special emphasis for me, because most individual entrepreneurs or early stage founders cite market research reports that say this is a $200 billion market of XYZ, but more often than not, as an associate, I have to do a bottoms up calculation, and many times it's not the case. So that's an area as well. But I'll go through each of these sections, but typically where I start is the team. What are they building? How large of a market is it? Then I think about, hey, what's so novel about the technology? What are they building that's really unique? And then I think about, hey, who else is building it? What are the competitors out there? And so that's how I think, and that's how my frame of reference. Because I'm talking to so many other, startups, I'm looking at thousands of decks. Typically, there's a pattern in which I look through a deck, and basically, I'm training myself to recognize patterns of success. And so, the more you follow this format, the easier it is for an investor to go through it and then ask the right questions or gauge their interest. And so, I think this is a pretty solid framework for both physical sciences and life sciences as well. So as I mentioned, very briefly, this is really a challenge for myself as well. How do you succinctly describe what you're trying to build or something that you spent years working on in as few words as possible? Not easy, but some examples are, for Kensai, risk prediction for healthcare powered by machine learning. Develop quantum circuits, develop, manufacture, and sell the first general purpose quantum computers. So there are some buzzwords, but I would try to keep that to a minimum. Lately, everything's been AI, ML, or quantum. It definitely gets the attention of many investors, but I would focus more on just describing what you build as simple as possible. I think for the life science investors, and this is extension of the question that was asked before, is that they'd probably really like to get to the science as soon as possible. What key data points are you trying to cover? What are the most impressive results from your papers? What's been, sort of the key differentiations. And this is, throughout the conversation that you have with the pitch deck, asking for VCs with help with team building and strategy is always a plus. I think the best conversations I've had are where, it's a two-way conversation, as I mentioned, and we're getting to know each other through that discussion, through the pitch deck. As I mentioned, the most important element for any investment is definitely the team. So what I would highlight is relevant experience. What makes you uniquely qualified to go after whatever challenge that you're focused on, whatever company you're focused on. We have a terminology that we call founder market fit. Like, what makes you so passionate about working on this particular idea? Have you studied it for 6 years? Is it part of your research? Was there some kind of spark as a child for, I don't know, researching oncology, for example? The reason why is that I think most investors want to make sure that you're in it for the long run. Most startups take 5 to 10 years to realize a return at any point. And so it takes like a lot of strong commitment. And what we're trying to assess is your commitment to the idea. The idea may change, but your commitment to solving the problem. And so that might change over time, the way you get to there, but the passion and the underlying focus for that particular problem should be evident through that conversation. Now, ideally, what's more impressive over time is that as you grow the company, I don't know your individual backgrounds, but what's always an outlier is being able to recruit experienced executives to surround yourself. I'm assuming that you're a first-time founder. Building a team that could have diverse skill sets is also really important. So maybe one person is really great at science, the other person is great at business development, but also has a scientific background. I mean, those are the type of combinations we like. In particular, at OUP, we've recognized that grad students who have founded a company, who have championed the research, have performed just as well as repeat entrepreneurs. And so that was a really interesting fact that we recently discovered before. So in many cases, if you're really passionate, you understand the science. The first few years are so dictated on the small decisions you make on the technical end that eventually lead to more commercial progress down the road. And these are some of the examples of decks we've seen. It's impressive. I know it's not always the case, but this is kind of where you should aspire to over time. We have noticed that if you're able to recruit an experienced executive with prior experience, you're more likely to have a higher probability of success, but it's not always true. As I briefly mentioned before, the market opportunity is a second area that I spend time with. I often get these market research reports quoting a large market. Let's say, for example, $1 billion plus for this XYZ. The only way you can do a bottoms-up calculation is really like to have some traction, initial conversation. So I always think that through the grants, I'm blanking on the name of the grants, but the ones in which allow you to have customer conversations are always telling, where you can have, we can identify exactly how much they're willing to pay for a solution, who are the right demographics, who's the internal champion if you're going B2B, for example, on the tech side. If you can kind of figure out that demographic, who the entire internal buyer is, and a price estimate, that always gives you more information. And typically what I try to do is get the unit economics and multiply it by the total size of the market. So a simpler example than this one is if you're selling, a software tool to developers, and there are 20 million developers in the US, and you can charge up to $10 or $100. So clearly it's a $200 million market if it's $10. Otherwise, it's a $2 billion market if you can charge more. And so clearly that's why so many companies are selling to developers, because there's a relatively large market. Here, other example. So this is another great point. I think in our space, in the university ecosystem, there have been a lot of great ideas. So silicon photonics is an example that comes up in my head a lot. For many years ago, there's a lot of growth in really research heavy areas in the tech and physical sciences space. Another example is fusion, which, has always been thought of as 20, 30 years away. And I think this is a really hard question to ask. Like, why in this moment can you justify why your novel research is going to produce the result, and why it won't take another 5 to 10 years to realize, why it'll take 3 to 4 years. Quite frankly, I think this is a hard point to make. No one really knows the future, but I think it's important to show trends. It's always more obvious looking backwards than forwards, but I think it's a good exercise to make you believe in why this is the right moment, and ultimately you're trying to convince me as well. So 2 examples here: Moore's law, computing is changing, therefore there's a room for different types of semiconductor styles. So this is a slide from Sci-Fi, which is commercializing an open source version of RISC-V. And if you were to thought about a competitor to ARM and x86 about 4 or 5 years ago, I think everyone would have thought you're a little bit out there. But now it looks like more and more obvious because Apple is adopting RISC-V. And so things are changing. And so does everyone really know? Not really, but you can make your best guess and best argument for it. More on the market opportunity. I think it's always helpful to give context. I think the probability of a single investor understanding your space is pretty low, especially at a generalist fund where we cover a lot of ground. On any given day, I look at a synthetic biology company or a quantum computing company. And for me, it's hard to context switch quite a bit and get up to speed fast. And so I think the more that you can describe the problem, what it does is give me comfort that you've researched the entire landscape as much as possible. And it just builds, it's all about trust at the end of the day, is that you know your stuff. And then you have a very clear picture of what's going on in the market. And there's a clear need for what you're building. And that's basically the crux of this section. For example, the bottom left is an IoT sensor company that's building a batteryless version. It's called Everactive. Less familiar with the right side, colorectal cancer, I think it might be Guardant. That actually is an interesting timing because Guardant was way ahead of its time in terms of liquid biopsy diagnostics. And now you see a flurry from Thrive to other examples of companies that are trying to commercialize similar technologies in different spaces or target different type of cancers. It's interesting looking at these slides, looking back and understanding what has worked and what has not. And the reality is that we don't know. We make our best guesses as investors. And this is just an extension of it. So problem, solution, simple way. This is what's happening in the market. This is what we're doing. And these are the customers, the internal champions. The more detailed, the better. It's all a hypothesis, but it just shows that you've done your homework. Data, evidence to support it, that's always great. It really depends on whether you're commercializing a tech and physical science opportunity or otherwise. Yeah, the more data you can support whatever you're building, the better. It's just proof points, whether it's through research or other types of data, as I mentioned.
Yeah, and I would just say here for your data, like there's certain data that you put in the main part of the pitch deck, and then there's other data you put in the appendix, and then there's other data that will eventually be in your data room. So that's just something that as you have a mentor, et cetera, you talk about like what is the right data to put where. Like obviously you want the main highlights of your data, but you can't put obviously every single experiment into your pitch deck. This is not a scientific presentation. This is a business presentation that you're giving. Definitely.
And I would say that, you're also trying to, continue the conversation. And so it's an art form of showing just enough to get an investor's attention to be able to have those follow-on conversations where maybe the next conversation is an hour-long tech diligence call, or the third conversation is access to a full data room after an NDA. And so it is also kind of like a way to continue the conversation. And remember, it's a two-way street. So you also have to feel comfortable with who the investor is. And so it gives you both time and data points to build that relationship over time. Roadmap is always helpful. This is probably more relevant for the tech and physical science side. It's really about understanding the pace of your innovation and, understanding the long-term vision. And what I would say is really important is we're pattern matching. We're trying to see how fast you move. And so we have a limited time to make an investment to return return money to our investors. And so the faster you can move, the more I can compare against other similar type of companies and technologies. And I can recognize that your pace of innovation is quite exceptional. And so I think you have to make a case for it. You also have to teach the investor where you want to take this company, essentially. Technology and product, briefly mention it. So I would not ignore this part, even if it's early and it's a little bit too soon for revenue. I think it's more when I think about your go-to-market strategy, I think about how many customer conversations have you really had? Are you commercially minded? Because as the leader of your organization, you're not just responsible for the technical aspects. You also have to build a business, as Kirsten mentioned. And so I think this is more about your thought process, depending on what stage you are at in the company. So let's assume that you're commercializing a software product. Are you going directly to customers? Are you reaching out to the Facebooks and Google's world? Or are you going through a channel partner, an intermediary who sells product into those companies? How are you licensing the model? How are you creating a business model? Are you selling a per user account? Are you trying to land and expand, meaning charge a slow amount and then slowly grow that amount over time? There's all these different strategies that, I don't know enough to say one is more successful than the other, but it's more about the approach and how well you've thought about it, because the ultimate goal is to grow this to a large business, assuming, hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue at some point. And so how you get to that? Is that revenue going to be recurring, not recurring? What do you expect the sales cycles to be? If you're selling to a large bank, it's going to be longer, or if you're selling into hospital systems, it's going to be much longer than compared to a startup, for example. It's more about your thought process here, and I think it's great to think about this early, even if it's years away. Competition slides. For me, the way I think about this is just to quickly get up to speed. Sometimes it's really hard to distinguish between potential competitors. And because I've seen so many deals across, so many pitches across the university ecosystem, I want to quickly be able to reason by analogy, meaning that, oh, you're like X, or how are you different from Y? I just spoke to them. It just actually, one, it just shows that you understand the market. Two, you're demonstrating quickly to investors who more or less have probably talked to your competitors, and you're trying to show how much better, how much improved you are compared to them. Life science, I would assume that it's more about the historical tendencies of certain targets, what has been done before, how is your approach, or how's your research different, and happy to follow up later on if there's any specific questions on this. Operational plan. Basically, I think I would take this as a way to think about, if you were to receive the funding, what's your plan? What are your timelines? What are your milestones? In this particular case, it's a life science example, but how do you get through an IND? How do you get through phase 2? How much money is required? What do you hope to accomplish? And the reality is that it doesn't always happen that way, but it's more about your thought process. But if you were to achieve these goals 6 to 9 months ahead of time, it is a positive signal. And investors like to think about signals because it's hard to be an expert in everything. And so what we have to do is prioritize kind of like the initial data points that you give us, and measure it in some quick way to understanding how like your potential solution or your potential startup is superior than others. Financing strategy. This is just sort of outlining how you've gone about funding so far, what your assumptions are. Kirsten did a great job of walking us through the stages. So typically there's pre-seed to seed to Series A to Series B. There's different kinds of inflection points that result in it. And again, this is just walking through your thought processes, maybe less important in the early stages, but I think having the mental exercise for yourself is just important to understand where you want to take it. I think the most important part is that if you've decided to create a venture-backed business, you're committed to a different lifestyle compared to maybe like completely owning your business on your own. You have to move fast, you have to meet targets, and it's a whole different type of pressure. And I would say that's like the first question I would ask each and every one of you is like, is this something you want to commit to? And it's okay if it's not a venture-backed business, but if you are, then there's a clear path here, and thinking through the inflection points just helps you.
The two things I was going to say is just when you're showing your financing and how your funding is going to be used, et cetera, you want to create these Gantt charts because everyone's going to hold you kind of to that. I mean, they know you're not going to usually hit everything, and there's going to be reasons why, et cetera. But you're going to want to create these Gantt charts, and then you're going to show like, we're going to get to here with this funding, and that's why this is an important inflection point. And then here's what we're going to do with the next round of funding and what that means. So that you're going to be showing that on your financing strategy slide.
Yeah. And there's a quick note on valuations, but whole
nother topic, really.
Whole nother topic, but let the market decide. I think that's great advice. And I would say my my advice to any new entrepreneur is don't focus on dilution and valuation. Focus on building a great company and surrounding yourself with the right type of investors. And I think we'll note in the next few years, given the pending recession, that many companies who have raised too much money with little traction are going to go through down rounds or may go out of business. And I think we have 2 more slides and then we can get through the questions, but summarize everything. I like to see typically most founders put their summary slide. They talk about how much they want to raise, just so it's top of mind. They give the highlights of why they're exceptional. So on the left side, you can see, hey, DC, VC, General Catalyst, Lux have invested in my companies. Here are the amazing experts and advisors. These are the traction elements. This is summarizing, the best parts of this company and why it's awesome. And Evolve is now a publicly traded company. And I think, Kirsten, you recently walked through an Evolve device.
I've done it many times. Love it. If you're going through stadiums lately and it's like really fast to get through the security part, that's why it's Evolve.
Yeah. And so obviously that might be a little more later stage than where your company is, but on the right side, I think it's great to summarize why what you're raising, what you plan to do with it, and why you think you'll be successful or what you do. And I would say that's an effective approach for the ends of the slide. And to sum it all up, I think there's a fundamental difference between pitching as an entrepreneur and scientist, but you need a combination of both, especially in tough tech or deep tech, as we mentioned. The biggest challenge is being able to simplify and condense everything that you've done over a number of years into something that's more understandable for an investor. Although they have a technical audience, like more or less like in our space in deep tech, the investors will have a PhD background or at least have a technical inclination. But even then, they're looking at thousands of companies, and I think it never hurts to simplify simplify what you're doing as quickly as possible so they can get up to speed. More or less, they may not be an expert in the space, so I'd highly recommend taking time to think through the basic elements of your pitch. And the great pitch decks, as I mentioned, show off the strength of the team. It has some kind of compelling, unique value proposition, large market opportunity, and clearly demonstrate why you're a potential amazing investment opportunity. And this is a personal preference, but great pitchers for us, you don't need to be the loudest person in the room or the most gregarious person. It's more about being transparent, being honest, being passionate about what you're building, showing founder market fit, and then being yourself. And there's not one style that is more successful than others. And so it's just about communicating the story in an authentic way.
So we do have a few questions, and I apologize because I have to run because I'm already late now for another meeting. But one question is, they're actually all from Shobita Singh. And says, who do we reach out to when we haven't built the tech yet, but have an idea that we'd like to pursue? So typically that's not a VC. That's more going to be on those earlier stage programs that can help you, say, okay, here's the next stage to take with your ideas. So go to your tech transfer office, go to your mentors programs, your EIR programs, et cetera, those programs that help you with that earlier part of it. Another question from Shobita was, when you mentioned that you accept school programs, do we have to be a PhD candidate? That's typically where we invest, is kind of in deep science. People are doing that deep science research. Typically, it's going to be people who are PhD candidates, postdocs, faculty members, et cetera. I don't know if we've ever invested in an undergrad startup. That's just not usually where the purview falls. And then the last question from Shobita and Ajay, I'm going to put this one to you because I do have to leave now for that meeting, is can we reach out to VC for development phase of the technology? So, thanks for just letting me join, everyone.
Thank you, Kirsten. I would say venture capitalists are open to having conversation in general if it's a compelling technology. I would say going back to the initial slide, I think there was like a a slide dictating the different stages in which venture capitalists invest in. And I would say those that are identified as angel investors or pre-seed investors would be more likely to have a conversation with you because they are inherently taking a risk on the team and the tech, much less concerned about the other aspects of the business. I would say for Osage University Partners, we want some traction, scientific validation, de-risking, maybe a little bit later stage than a seed, maybe a seed plus. And so it goes back to the point, it just depends on the investment thesis of the firm. And so a great example would be to target like a firm like the Engine, in addition to the resources that you have on campus. There's also Cantos VCs. There's a number of venture capitalists that specialize in very, very early stage, like paper and napkin ideas. Are there any more questions?
If there is no question, maybe Alice, maybe we can close.
I think, yep, go for it. Alice, Chris, Linda,
Yeah.
are there any more questions? Or
I don't think so, but thank you so much, Ajay, and also Kirsten for presenting this. There's a lot of interest. At one point, I saw like about 70 people was in the webinar, and from our researchers and people in our community. And it's a conversation certainly very important for the new venture direction. And thank you so much. And we hope to talk with you more, and also for the audience, and we'll love to engage you in further conversations. Thank you so much.
yeah, please feel free to reach out to my email, rayasam@oup.vc. Happy to talk with anyone or engage over email. Please feel free to reach out to me or my partners at OUP, and we're always privileged and we're thankful to partner with Cornell, and we're excited to contribute to many more webinars in the future.
Okay, thank you so much. All right, Linda and Chris, is there any other housekeeping matters, or this is it?
I will thank you everyone for attending, and we'll follow up with a survey as well as the link where you will be able to have the video or the link to the presentation that Ajay and Kirsten they have presented.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.